Good evening. This is Lacey Hong with the Alberta Medical Association. I will be moderating the webinar this evening. This webinar is a collaboration between the AMA, PFSP, and WellDoc Alberta. Welcome to Physician Wellness, Feeling Distress, Understanding Loss, and Finding Meaning. Next slide, please. One more slide, please. Thank you. During the webinar, you should be able to see the presentation as well as the speaker. Clicking on the Zoom tiles may change your display. All participant microphones and video cameras have been disabled. On a Windows device, you can adjust your screen ratio by selecting View options at the top of your screen, clicking the arrow, and choosing the viewing option best for you. If you adjust the size, you may need to use your mouse to move the presentation left or right within your Zoom screen. If you are using an iPad or iPhone, you can use the pinching motions with your fingers to zoom in or out. Next slide, please. Today we will be using a tool called Mentimeter, and is a way for you to respond and interact during the session. We encourage you to participate. However, if you decide not to use Menti.com, you can use a pencil and paper to participate on your own or as a family. To access Mentimeter, you can download the mobile app or open an internet browser and type in menti.com, MENTI.com. After browsing to the web page, you will be prompted for a code. The speaker will indicate the Menti code during their presentation and throughout today's webinar. The code will also be displayed on the slide and referenced several times throughout today's session. Next slide, please. Please note that the webinar you are participating in is being recorded. By participating, you understand and consent to the webinar being made publicly available via a link on the AMA and WellDoc Alberta website for an undetermined length of time. Next slide, please. We would like to recognize that we are webcasting from and to many different parts of Alberta today. The province of Alberta is located on Treaty 6, Treaty 7, and Treaty 8 territory, and is a traditional meeting ground and home for many Indigenous peoples. Next slide, please. This program has received in-kind support from WellDoc Alberta through contributions made by Alicia Polachek and the WellDoc Alberta team. WellDoc Alberta is funded by Scotiabank in collaboration with MD Management and the Canadian Medical Association. Next slide, please. Today, we will hear from Fleur Yamal, Registered Clinical Social Worker and Managing Director of Third-Party Service Provider Physician and Family Support Program, AMA, Dr. Terry Brandon, Clinical and Program Director, Physician and Family Support Program, AMA, Alicia Polachek, Co-Lead and Program Manager, WellDoc Alberta, and Adjunct Research Assistant Professor of Medicine, University of Calgary, Dr. Jane Lemaire, Physician Lead, WellDoc Alberta, and Clinical Professor of Medicine, Department of Medicine, University of Calgary. We extend our thanks to these individuals for their expertise and support today. This webinar has been approved for 1.25 Main Pro Plus credits. The evaluation link will be displayed in a web browser when you leave the Zoom webinar. Next slide, please. The Planning Committee has contributed to the consideration of learning needs, the determination of learning objectives, the development of program content, and the choice of speakers and presenters. The Planning Committee has reviewed the content of the presentation and ensured that the content presented is evidence-based and free of undue influence. As per CME requirements, all speakers and moderators have completed conflict of interest forms, and their disclosures are outlined on the following slides. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. I'd now like to welcome Dr. Jennifer Williams, who will provide opening remarks on behalf of the AMA Board.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Jennifer Williams, and on behalf of the AMA Board of Directors, I would like to welcome you to the 10th webinar in our series, Maintaining and Optimizing Your Practice During Times of Rapid Change. The AMA is committed to bringing you relevant and timely information during these uncertain and challenging times, and our webinars are just one way in which we are doing that. To date, our webinars have been very well received. We've had 7,500 attendees across 9 webinars and just under 1,700 questions generated. I think we can all agree those are great numbers. I'm pleased to see that we've got such a large group online with us this evening as well. Tonight's webinar is titled Physician Wellness, Feeling Distress, Understanding Loss, and Finding Meaning, a very timely and relevant topic. I certainly don't need to tell any of you that as a profession, we have endured rapid and unprecedented changes in these last few months. Between working to care for our patients during a pandemic, trying to keep them, ourselves, and our families safe, and enduring the extreme stress brought upon us by the government's actions, the situation has been challenging, to say the least. We are operating under unprecedented circumstances. The combination of the global pandemic and termination of our agreement has been overwhelmingly difficult, and many physicians, including myself, are sincerely worried about our patients, the future of our practices, and our livelihood. The loss of normalcy and security can understandably be quite stressful and difficult to deal with. During this session, we will consider and come to a better understanding of distress during challenging times. Our webinar facilitators will guide us through short pauses for self-reflection at various times throughout the evening as well. I'm so proud to say that we are bringing you tonight's session in collaboration with WellDoc Alberta. For those of you who may not know, WellDoc Alberta is an independent organization focused on advancing a collaborative, cooperative, pan-provincial approach to physician wellness. WellDoc Alberta works with healthcare organizations across the province, including the AMA's Physician and Family Support Program, to support education and promote physician wellness. WellDoc Alberta is funded by the Affinity Funds through Scotiabank, MD Financial Management, and the Canadian Medical Association. This successful funding was one of the first facilitated by our Memorandum of Understanding with the Canadian Medical Association. You may recall that this partnership was set up to align our member engagement activities and partner on joint initiatives that advance our shared priorities. And I can't think of a better shared priority than physician wellness, especially at this challenging time. I would also like to take the opportunity to welcome Dr. Christine Molnar to tonight's webinar, our AMI president. I know she's very excited to be with all of us tonight. I'd like to thank all of you for being with us this evening, and I look forward to what we are going to learn together. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Molnar for a quick introduction.
Hi to everyone. I'm just thrilled to be here tonight, and I see we have quite a big crowd. I'm very excited for the new learning and for all of us joining together in this incredible activity. I hope this all helps us find a path of healing and a path to be able to sustain ourselves in health and resiliency. And with that, let's get going.
Thank you, Dr. Williams and Dr. Molnar. Next slide, please. I would now like to pass the torch over to Dr. Terry Brandon, Dr. Jane Lemaire, and Fleur Yamol, who will lead us through our featured content today.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Dr. Molnar. My name is Dr. Jane Lemaire, and I'm the physician lead for WellDoc Alberta. As Jennifer stated, our physician wellness focus is on education and prevention of burnout, and we do so through collaboration. So we start out with this slide and really thank all those listed here who helped us to develop this webinar tonight. Next slide. We're really happy that you've joined us this evening. We really miss the face-to-face interactions. It's a bit harder to do that through a webinar. So we're trying something a little different tonight. This session really targets our individual wellness as physicians to help us better understand our distress related to the recent upheavals in our lives. And we're hoping to provide you with some tools to help you get through. Fleur Yamol is our content expert, and she will provide us with knowledge. Throughout the webinar, though, we're going to ask you to do some self-reflection, and we'll give you some opportunities to do that, and also share your experiences with us if you wish. To be clear, your shared responses will not be viewed publicly. Alicia Polachek from WellDoc Alberta will be working in the background, summarizing the responses, and sharing those with the group. Also, if you do submit any questions into the chat box, please know we don't have a formal Q&A session tonight, so they also won't be publicly displayed, but they will get answered in a follow-up bulletin in a frequently asked question format, and those will be distributed to participants. Next slide, please. So as ever, we have formal learning objectives this evening. At the end of the session, participants will be able to identify the common human reactions to loss of normalcy as a result of the rapid changes in our lives. Connect the emotions we experience during this time to the construct of grief. Describe strategies to help manage our distress during the various stages of grief. And hopefully we'll be able to apply these strategies to move beyond grief with new meaning and purpose. Next slide, please. So as I said before, this webinar targets us, physicians, as people, as individuals. I remember a planning meeting at the very beginning of the pandemic where we sat around a table, a virtual table, and talked about being very lucky that we at least had some foundations of system-level physician wellness resources that would help us through, and that many other jurisdictions did not. But we also had a sobering discussion that no matter what resources existed, that this was going to be really hard for physicians, and it has been. So this webinar is really about our emotions that are rooted in the loss of normalcy in our lives. On a personal level, we have had very little control over the pandemic, or for that matter, on many aspects of the government-imposed changes in how we work and care for our patients. But at the same time, we've had this intense emotional reaction to these events, and it's legitimate. But it's important for us to address the very real threat of that emotional response. And that's the next hard part for us, is that we have to start to work through and come out on the other side. Next slide. So in general, if you look at the literature on psychological response, there are phases. And for us, ostensibly, we are going to go through each of those phases. If we look at the preparation phase when we first started hearing about the pandemic and, of course, the ongoing issues with the government, I think it's fair to say that we had a lot of anticipatory anxiety because we really weren't sure how we'd be affected. There were so many unknowns. You tried to plan, but there was uncertainty, and it was just really stressful to not understand what might happen. Then as the active phase happened and we were faced with the pandemic as well as our other issues, we had significant and a very acute upheaval in our lives. And so many of us had to rise with heroics and a surge to solutions. And those solutions included our work lives and our professional lives. There were long hours, there were increased tensions across our work and our home lives, a lot of urgency. You know, when we first looked at the models that were coming out, that created a very real sense of urgency, frustration, confusion as we tried to adapt to the changes within the healthcare system, and also how it affected our personal lives. And then still in the active phase, time wore on, and here we are in this full-on mode, high levels of adrenaline. We actually start to feel disillusionment and exhaustion. We may face moral distress, compassion fatigue, again, increasing tensions at work and home, and that stress becomes cumulative. And it's been months and months and months for us all of cumulative stress. So at some point, we're hoping to get through to the next phase, which is the recovery phase. And I'm not sure that we know yet what that looks like, but in some way we have to find what our new normal will be. And in doing so, along the way, we have to deal with the psychological impacts of what we've experienced in the last little while. I would venture to say that many of us are at the disillusionment and exhaustion phase, and hopefully some of you are at the recovery phase. And as we go through this evening and do some self-reflection, we can share some of that together. Next slide, please. So we're going to start. We'll put you to work a little bit here. As part of our recovery, we really need to identify our emotions. Naming our emotions can be really powerful. We have to acknowledge what we're feeling, and that helps us understand why. And sharing it with others helps us to understand that it's actually normal to feel pretty unwell right now. So let's take a moment to do that together. We're going to put up a list of feelings for you to consider. And if you like, you can just grab a paper and a pencil, or you can just do it inside your head. If you like, we welcome you if you wanted to share the feelings that you're having into Mentimeter. And the code is here on the slide. It's 994225. And also, if there are other strong feelings that aren't represented on this list, of course, feel free to enter them as well. Next slide, please. So here's a list of some positive and negative emotions. So if you want to take a minute, we're going to have a minute of quiet here for us to reflect on what we may be feeling right now. So we're going to circle back to Alicia so she can tell us a little bit about anything that you may have entered into Mentimeter. And if not, maybe we'll just move on. Alicia?
Thank you. As you can see there coming up in our slides, there's a lot of emotions that have come in. So thank you all for participating. It's always helpful to hear the thoughts coming from our participants this evening. In the center there, in some of the biggest words, you can see kind of that exhaustion. There's a lot of words that came up as tired as well, which didn't reflect in the size of that exhaustion word, but a lot of talk about being tired, exhausted, a lot of comments around being scared, fearful, feeling anxious or anxiety around the time right now. Anger, frustration were another common one. And then there was kind of a theme around not feeling appreciated or not feeling as effective. Powerless is in there, useless, a lot of those words that kind of get at that idea about just feeling a little bit inadequate or ineffective right now. So yeah, a lot of really powerful emotions there, as you can see. So thank you for sharing, and I'll pass it back to you, Jane.
Thank you, Alicia, and thanks everyone for sharing how you're feeling right now. In the world of physician wellness, physicians are supposed to be invulnerable and be able to be resilient to everything. And sometimes we feel like we're the only ones that are experiencing emotions like this. And it's been just wonderful to see lots of collegial support, people sharing, and coffee conversations or hallway conversations or clinic conversations. And I think this word cloud is telling us that we're all still feeling some very powerful emotions. Next slide, please. So these are emotions, but these emotions come from our losses. So the next activity that we'd like in our self-reflection, we want you to take a moment and again write down maybe 3 or 4 or even 5 things that you might have lost recently and that you really miss. And again, you can just write them down on a piece of paper. You can just take time in your head to think about them or put them into Mentimeter for us. And remember, this can be anything at all in your personal or your professional life. So I hope you've had a chance to document some of the things that have been lost to you. We're going to give Alicia some time to summarize and synthesize what you've written. So she'll come back to us later in our webinar with those results. And now I'd like to hand over to Dr. Terry Brandon. And next slide, please.
Hi, and welcome everybody. As mentioned, I'm the Clinical and Program Director for PFSP, and tonight, just to give some context to our discussion, I'd like to share some of our recent observations at PFSP. Based on our interactions with physicians who call the line, we know that many are worried about the present situation. Earlier this year, back in January, February, when the government declared their intent to impose changes on physicians, the volume of calls to PFSP increased significantly, about 35% over the same time last year, with many callers expressing their anger, disappointment, and fear for the future of patient care. Then in March, when COVID changed the world, the volume of calls dramatically decreased by about 15% compared to the previous year. While we don't know exactly why, we surmise that physicians were struggling with the realities of changing the way they practice, dealing with safety concerns, homeschooling, and everything else that was going on. However, what we noticed is that while there were fewer calls, the complexity and the length of each call increased by about 40%. It seems that those who did take the time to call were very distressed and had a lot to talk about. And while total calls were down, there were some notable exceptions to the trend. Calls from rural physicians and learners, residents and medical students were up, and we saw increases in calls about mental health concerns, work-related stress, and substance use. Also, the AMA recently surveyed Alberta physicians asking for feedback on their urgent needs and preparing for what comes next. They received almost 4,500 responses. The top 3 concerns regarding COVID were loss of income, destabilization of medical practice, and the risks of safety to their family. As you might expect, personal safety and their own emotional stress came further down the list. The comments from survey participants referred to a variety of emotions: stress, anger, fear, and worry, to name a few. Now, we know from previous studies that physicians are remarkably resilient and adaptable in the face of change. What we're seeing now is a physician population that's not only dealing with the changes and risks forced upon them by a global pandemic, but also by a political climate that's led them to feel devalued and vulnerable. We're hoping that the information in this webinar tonight will be helpful in your understanding of your own emotional response. Next slide, please. We are so grateful to have Fleur joining us today as our content expert for this webinar on the topic of feeling stress, understanding loss, and finding meaning. Fleur is a valued member of our PFSP team. She has over 20 years of experience as a clinical social worker who has worked with physicians through PFSP, first as a therapist and now as the administrator of our 24/7 support line. Next slide. Fleur, earlier Jane talked about how our emotions are connected to our grief over the loss of normality in our lives. I'm not sure that I would have recognized these emotions as being related to grief. Can you tell us what exactly grief is and how it manifests itself?
Absolutely, and thank you for having me come tonight, and I'm very excited to be able to share some of my thoughts around the things that we're experiencing now. So I want to start by talking about how grief is the emotional response that we have to loss. It is a powerful and necessary process for people to engage in so that we can move beyond the devastation and despair to a state of peacefulness and balance. I've often been asked if a person can die of a broken heart, and I believe that if we don't process grief effectively, we can become emotionally stuck so that we are unable to create connection, passion, or joy. And from my perspective, that would be the essence of an emotional death. Now, I know that may seem really extreme, but for any of you who have ever lost a parent, a child, a spouse, your health, or your career, I'm sure you can identify with a feeling that you thought you could never love again or feel joy. The reason that I paint such an extreme image about grief and the need to process it in a healthy way is to validate and normalize how hard it is to manage grief and to do the work that is required to move beyond grief to meaning and purpose. And like anything that feels impossible, sometimes we take the path of least resistance and avoid it. And the best way I know how to avoid something is to not even be aware that it's even happening, to deny that you're struggling, to put on a brave face, and to help all those people around you feel better that you're better. While this may work in the short term, in the long term, the repression of one emotion will result in the repression of all. I also believe that in North America, we still experience some stigma associated with grief. I think as a society, we do not embrace the emotions that come along with grief, and that we are quite uncomfortable with those people who are grieving. There is a desire for the person to be and feel better, and I do find that it comes from our general discomfort with difficult emotions. We are often paralyzed with fear when we see other people crying or being upset, and we often avoid saying anything to someone because we don't want to make it worse. So I want to talk about grief today in a way that will empower you to tackle the difficulties that come with it. to help you understand the reason that you are feeling the different things you are feeling, and to provide some strategies so that when things feel really, really big, you have some tools in your toolbox to manage what you're experiencing. I do want to say a few things before we dive in. First, everyone experiences grief differently depending on the loss, your current state of functioning at the time of the loss, and the resources that you have available to you. There is no right or wrong when it comes to processing grief, as it is unique to every individual. I also want to say that when you experience loss, grief is the natural, normal response that all humans have. Just like if you were to put your hand on a hot burner, you will feel pain. Every person who does this will feel pain. You would never question why you feel the pain. You may question why you put your hand on the burner to begin with, but you would never devalidate the pain that results in that action. So just like the physical pain you feel, grief is a normal, natural response you will have to loss. And so I would encourage you to not question the emotions you experience as you grieve. I also don't want to assume that you're all grieving. That is not what today is about. However, if you have felt any sense of loss due to the pandemic, then there is a good chance that you're in some sort of grief process.
When I think of all the losses we've experienced, there's big ones like the loss of a loved one, and then there are ongoing ones like the loss of certainty about our future and about our financial security. And then there are little things like haircuts or just going to the mall. Seems like the emotions are quite different for each type of loss.
Mm-hmm. Yes, there are different types of grief that we can experience. And I'm really glad, Terry, that you mentioned losses like haircuts and going to the mall, because while these may seem trivial, they are the things that help life feel normal. As a physician, you have likely experienced many losses as a result of the pandemic and the government's implementation of the physician funding framework. You have experienced a time in medicine that may seem surreal because many of you have never been through anything like this. I know I haven't. Loss of certainty about your practice or career will look like, and for medical students and residents, it is the loss of educational opportunities and their timelines. The future is very uncertain, and with this uncertainty, we can experience anticipatory grief. Anticipatory grief happens when the future is so uncertain. We begin to think about the possible losses even before they occur. With the changing protocols and structure of practice, physicians are constantly having to alter and change how they practice medicine. There is the uncertainty with respect to safety and exposure as a result of treating patients with COVID-19. The preparation and the potential ICU cases and deaths that may come as a result of the virus is front and center. And now, as we relaunch the economy, the uncertainty of a second wave. Finally, the uncertainty of how the funding framework will impact your ability to earn an income, provide for yourself and your family. And while many of these things have not yet happened, the mere thought of a possible loss can begin to create a grief process. I also want to talk about disenfranchised grief, which is a type of grief that is not generally acknowledged by society and may have some social stigma attached to it. The funding framework that affects your ability to practice medicine the way you want and need to is an example of disenfranchised grief. The general public is not aware of how these changes will impact your practice. They do not understand the devaluation of your profession and the erosion of your ability to make decisions about patient care. This is an incredibly isolating experience of grief. When society does not acknowledge the loss, you don't often get the compassion and empathy that you need because others are not aware or even in agreement of the significance of that loss. And finally, I want to talk about cumulative grief. And this is a type of grief that can occur when we experience loss after loss after loss. And cumulative grief occurs when we have not had a chance to process grief due to one loss before we experience another. For physicians, this can be in the form of a loss of a patient due to COVID, then the loss of a friend or colleague due to COVID, then new information regarding billing codes and PPE costs, and then seeing colleagues choosing to move their practice or to stop practicing altogether. grief can really turn us upside down and inside out. And if we continue to experience loss after loss before we feel solid ground underneath us again, that can lead to a state of instability that may be very difficult to recover from. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Fleur. At this point, let's take a moment to review our responses to the self-reflection we did recently. Alicia's working in the background and gathering your input, so I'll hand this over to her now.
Thank you, Terry. Next slide, please. So as you can see here, we should have some results that are scrolling. We got a lot of really good comments again in the background through Menti, so thank you for that. I'm going to synthesize, you'll see some of them scrolling, but I'm going to synthesize kind of what some of the big themes were that I saw coming out. So one of the ones was just around that lack of normalcy. Things aren't like they used to be. We can't just go for a haircut. We can't go to the mall. We can't make plans to travel, go for a night out, go to our kids' dance recitals, play dates, all of those kinds of examples came up. So a lot of really good examples about just those usual activities that we can't engage in any longer, or at least for a while. Seeing patients in person was another one. I think a lot of physicians right now seem to be struggling with that new way of seeing patients and how it lacks some of that personal connection. So we heard a bit about that as well. Kind of relatedly, there was some comments around the loss of financial security and the usual work, having to adapt and deliver care in a different way. Also, the loss of collegiality with colleagues or consistent work. So for some people, perhaps their hours are actually reduced as well. A few people spoke about a loss of hope, a loss of sense of the future, a lack of confidence in the system or the government, as well as in their kind of own feelings of worth or value, loss of feeling significant or important, loss of direction or purpose. So a lot of those kinds of emotions kind of came out here as well in terms of things that are lost. There's a few comments as well around that loss of freedom. So tying back to that idea of just not being able to do those normal activities or move about like we usually might. And a sense of safety for either self or family members came up a few times as well. One of the other ones was just that loss of time or space, having that personal time or downtime, especially if you have kids at home. I'm sure that's challenging to find a quiet moment for yourself these days. A loss of emotional energy, a loss of control. And I think overall, the biggest theme that really came out was that loss of social interaction. We're human beings. We like that interaction. We thrive off that interaction. And I think a lot of people are feeling that right now, that loss of connection with friends, with family, the inability to go to celebrations or celebrate things with family members. Anniversaries, for example, came up. And then some really touching ones around just missing hugs, missing that human touch and interaction and connection, and missing laughter. So thank you all. I'll pass it back to Terry.
Thanks, Alicia. So it looks like, we're all experiencing loss. And at this point, a lot of us, as we can see, are thinking about our losses. Some of our losses are recent and some remote. And we might be thinking about how we reacted to that. Fleur, I know that much has been studied and written about the grief process, and I'm wondering if there's a framework that you find helpful in making sense of our emotions and our behaviors around loss.
Yes, thanks, Terry. The framework that I really like to work from is the one developed by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She is credited with conceptualizing grief into 5 different stages. And David Kessler more recently added a 6th stage to the process. And it's really important for me to acknowledge that while they are called stages of grief, the process is not linear, and that people will often bounce between the different stages as they process grief. I wish I could say that you could go through the stages in order, one by one, and then you are done. But the reality of it is that you can jump between the stages often, which is what makes grieving so difficult. I also want to say that grief will likely be the most exhausting process you will ever experience. And the reason that this is probably best described in an analogy. Most of us have a pantry at home where we keep food items that supplement our day-to-day nourishment. When we start a grief process, we stop stocking the pantry. So normally, as you use things in the pantry, you replace them the next time you are in the store. With grief, you stop doing that. Instead, you use what is in the pantry without replacing it, and then eventually all you have in there are your spices and some Kraft Dinner. When we are grieving, we cannot allow replenishment of energy because we expend more than we can recover. The other reason that we cannot replenish the pantry is because it is very difficult during this time to let people in. When we feel devastated, we are worried that we may get hurt again. So we cut ourselves off from the outside world for a period of time because we feel too vulnerable. When working with clients, I often hear them say that they could just sleep forever. I even had one client express that they could run 3 marathons back to back and still not feel as tired as they did while they were grieving. People will often say that there are so many people out there reaching out and trying to help, but they just don't know what anyone can do for them in that moment. So I'd like to go through each of the stages in a bit more detail. And as I do, I'd like to invite those of you who are listening in to maybe think of some of the examples of the different stages that you may have experienced, or maybe that you have seen in your peers. Your experience may not be what I am describing, and that is completely normal. Each person will have a unique experience. I will start with denial as the first stage of grief. Now, this stage is critical at the beginning and sometimes throughout, as it allows you to do the things you need to do to get on with life. For physicians, this may come in the form of minimizing just how terrible things will get with COVID, or the idea that it might not be as bad in Canada as it was in China. You may have also said that we have had coronaviruses around for a really long time, so this really won't be any worse than getting a cold or the flu. And to some degree, you needed to experience denial so you could go to work, see your patients, contribute to the different committees you belong to in an attempt to help. Denial is important, but you cannot stay there. The predominant thing I hear people say when they're at this stage of grief is, it will all be okay. I will be just fine. The next stage is called anger, and while this can be the most predominant emotion you can feel many other emotions as well in this stage. Now, if I could rename this stage, I would call it the roller coaster of emotion stage. People will feel all sorts of varying emotions and may quickly jump from one emotion to another. This is a stage where the denial wears off and all those emotions that we were denying and putting away have clustered together and are clamoring to get released. It can become confusing because these emotions may have blended in with one another, and it may be difficult to identify the individual emotions, which is why it can feel super overwhelming. I'd like to use the sweaty gym sock analogy to try and explain what this stage is like. Now, if you were to throw a bunch of clean, dry clothes on a sweaty gym sock in the corner of the room, eventually the sweat and mildew will permeate all the other clothes and they all become mixed together. What you are left with is a pile of clothes that smell terrible, and you can't distinguish the clean from the not clean. I want to say that anger is a very powerful emotion, and the reason this becomes the most prominent emotion is because it does help to protect us. For physicians, this stage can be where we look to find blame for all that is happening and finding ways to advocate for what we believe to be right. The predominant thing I hear people say when they're in this stage of grief is, I really feel like I'm going crazy. The next stage is called bargaining. This is a stage where we attempt to regain control over the things that we have lost. When our world gets turned upside down, we want to find some way to make things right again. For physicians, this is where you decide to be part of different groups to make the changes necessary to bring order to the chaos. This is where you tell yourself that if you work really, really, really hard and take all the precautions, then perhaps your family and loved ones will stay safe. This is a stage where many will act in selfless ways to ensure the protection of others. Bargaining is important because it is about trying to regain some control and power in your life. Many of you can identify some perfectionistic tendencies. and the nature of the work often demands that you are perfect in the work that you do. Having control over the things that happen in your life is the foundation of perfectionism, and this is why this stage can be so very difficult. It feels like there is absolutely no margin for error, and in some cases, this is also the reality and the expectation. The predominant thing I hear when people are at this stage is, if I do everything perfectly, then everything will be okay. The next stage is depression. And I want to really say that this stage is very different from the sadness that you might feel due to the loss, but rather involves feelings of hopelessness and helplessness. This is where we feel consumed by the loss. The fatigue of experiencing all the emotions that go with grieving is front and center. There is a sense that no matter what I do, nothing will ever be the same. For physicians, given the lack of control over how the government is choosing to conduct discussions about the funding framework, you may feel that there is no point in fighting or even paying attention. Nothing you do will make a difference, so why bother? I would say that the predominant thing I hear when people are at this stage is, what's the point? The final stage of grief is acceptance, which is where we find the balance and the gift of the loss we've experienced. This is where we recognize our strength, capacity, and agency, and come out on the other side of grief. This is where we find that it is not about getting over the loss, but rather learning how to live with it. We discover a new structure to our lives that will also provide peace, joy, and connection. This is where we take our part of the loss and let go of the parts of the loss that we could not control. For physicians, perhaps this is about not allowing the funding framework to devalue you, but to choose how to work within the framework while still advocating for change. For some of you, this may be a turning point in your career, and you may leave medicine or change the way you practice your craft or where you practice. But you do so based on your belief in your value versus being a victim of injustice. This is a stage where you see how medicine and our healthcare system responded to the pandemic and feel proud of your contribution, even though things may be forever changed going forward. This is a stage where you reclaim your grounding and feel confident about your ability to move forward. The predominant thing I hear people say when they're at this stage of grief is, I can really see why this happened. Next slide, please. And I believe this is where David Kessler introduces the sixth stage of grief, which is about finding meaning beyond grief. This is an opportunity to reset what we have known and to create a new purpose and passion going forward. This stage is about moving beyond acceptance in a hopeful way that honors our loss. I don't want to minimize how difficult this can be. I also acknowledge that some people may never fully come to acceptance or meaning. They never find the gift, and that is somewhat normal. This is where, though, I would encourage seeking professional help to work through some of the underlying trauma that may be associated with the loss you experienced. I want to leave you with another analogy for how grief may manifest in us. When you first experience grief, you hold it in both of your hands. That makes it very difficult for you to feed yourself, drive your car, or do your job. You feel completely powerless to live life the way you used to. Eventually, as you process grief, you can shift it so that it's a bit smaller and can fit in one hand. Now you have one hand free to do what you need to do. It is better, but still difficult. Eventually, you will feel comfortable putting grief in your pocket so that both your hands are free. It stays with you, but it no longer gets in your way. Next slide, please.
Well, thank you so much, Fleur. And thanks to everyone for inputting your comments. We've seen so many really great thoughts, and we appreciate you sharing it with us. So for this self-reflection exercise, we're going to ask you, what stage of grief do you think you might be predominantly experiencing today? And again, if you like, you could just write it out, but we're going to go ahead and ask you to put it into Mentimeter with the same code, 994225. We will see a real-time response. We're having a little bit of a delay, So Alicia will say a few words as we start seeing your responses in the background. And then after that, Fleur will come back and tie this all into what she's teaching us today. Next slide.
Thank you, Jane. As we wait for the results to start showing on your end, I can see them in the back end. And right now we're seeing, oh, they're showing for you now. Predominantly depression is coming up. No one's in that denial stage. So it looks like we are largely in the depression or the acceptance stage. And since they're showing now, Fleur, I will turn it over to you as you want to chime in to tie it back to some of your previous concepts.
Sorry. So I think when we were thinking about the kind of feedback we might get, you know, I'm not surprised that we're kind of experiencing the depression stage of grief at this point, given everything that we've been through. And the first thing I want to say is, you know, given some of your responses, there's obviously some commonalities with what you are experiencing, and that, you know, that really people are kind of grieving in similar ways based on you know, how we describe the different stages, and still seeing things pop up. So, you know, I'm going to say that we are predominantly in the depression stage. So this is the, you know, for a lot of people, it can be the really scary phase, the really demotivated phase, the phase where we're feeling really hopeless and helpless and powerless. And so I really want to, you know, maybe connect this back to what Jane had said earlier in our webinar, where, you know, in that active phase when, you know, some of that adrenaline is really going, but after a period of prolonged crisis, we can all really get to that state of disillusionment and exhaustion. And so I really, you know, back to Jane's comment about, you know, acknowledging that this is kind of a normal part of not only our psychological response to crisis, but our emotional response of grief over all the things that we have lost. So I'm really excited to maybe start talking about some of the strategies to try and manage this, so that we can start to feel a bit more powerful over what's going on for us. Next slide, please.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Fleur and Alicia, and thanks to all of you for sharing your thoughts on that. Fleur, a few minutes ago, just before the self-reflection exercise, you gave us a really helpful analogy about how eventually we come to carry grief in our pocket. Do you have any thoughts on how we can help ourselves progress through the stages and get to that?
Mm-hmm. So like I mentioned before, the grief process is not linear, and you may bounce between the different stages, and that can be very confusing and frustrating. But I want to reassure you that is actually the key to processing grief. That is actually the key to managing grief, is to keep moving through the different stages. What we want to do is begin to create awareness, which is what we're trying to do tonight, of the stage that you may be in. And the most important piece is to do that without any judgment. You know, I encourage you to observe the movement within the grief process with curiosity. When we are curious, we can increase our ability to be self-aware and really tap into what is going on for us. And again, if you're finding that you're staying stuck, and some people do stay stuck in anger, that may be where you found yourself early on in the process, and you know, and now that we see many of us in the depression stage, if you're finding that you are stuck at all, that would be a really good time to reach out and call the line and seek some professional help. And so I think the best way I can describe it is to keep bouncing and to keep moving.
Okay, thanks. You also described how grief comes with a variety of really painful emotions. So while we think about those, and maybe it helps us to be able to name those emotions, I'm wondering if there's anything we can actually do to help us through the process.
Again, you know, it's one of those
Next
things
slide,
like,
please.
sorry, Terry. Again, while it's great to name our emotions and be aware of our emotions, I know as physicians, you really want to know what do I do about this now, Fleur? That's what I really want to know. And it's fine that I'm feeling anger, or I'm in the depression stage, or, I'm popped back into denial, but what do I do? And I think that this is really, kind of where I feel really privileged when I work with clients, because I too like to be really proactive, and I really like to come up with strategies. And so I do believe that there are actions that we can engage in each stage that will help us process the grief. And I do believe that these actions can empower us and continue to build resilience. So I do believe that each stage of grief has a purpose and is meant to help us manage what is going on. So I do want to give you some actions that you can take when you notice that you are in whatever stage you happen to be in. That's going to help you feel a bit more powerful and maybe have a bit more agency over what is going on for you emotionally. And remember, the goal is to identify the stage you're at without any judgment, and then engage in these activities. So I want to start with denial. So the goal in this stage is to focus on the basics, to get grounded in what you need to do from a moment-to-moment basis. Here is where you would focus on your basic needs. So that would be nutrition, exercise, sleep, obtaining the resources you need to ensure basic functioning. The goal is to get grounded in what is real and what is tangible. And this is maybe where creating some routine or structure can be really helpful and really important. That way, you may feel like you might have some predictability in your day. When you find yourself in the anger phase, or the roller coaster of emotions phase, there are two things that you can focus on in this stage. One of them is that being in this stage is a signal to you that you need to set some boundaries and to be protective of the things that are important to you, your family, your work, your personal health. This is where you want to pick the activities that take less energy, but gives you lots of energy in return. So for physicians, this may be about seeing patients versus contributing to a committee, advocating for change, or researching protocols. This is where, saying no can be really helpful. And please know that just because you say no now does not mean that you will always say no. Also, if you're able to identify the other emotions you are feeling, then you can normalize and validate that these emotions have purpose and meaning, and that you can find ways to meet the needs that these emotions are trying to trigger you to meet. So for example, if you're feeling sad, then seek some comfort. If you're feeling anxious, then create a plan for what you're worried about. If you happen to be feeling guilty, then try to focus on the intention behind your action versus the outcome of those actions. Now, this is the essence of emotion-focused therapy, which is where we recognize that emotions are critical in decision-making and are part of what makes us whole. Just like the pain in our hand after touching a hot burner is a signal to remove our hand from the burner, the emotions we are feeling signal us to do something that will resolve that concern in our life. And finally, I think in this stage, it's really important to practice compassion and empathy to yourself and to others. In the bargaining stage, the goal is to regain control over your perception that you have lost control. So for physicians, the actions in this stage could be about focusing on your craft. See your patients and treat them the way that you feel is best given your knowledge and experience. Move away from trying to fix the things that are out of your control. The changing protocols, the funding changes, the weather. This is where you would focus on making the best decision you can with the knowledge you have versus that feeling that you need to know everything before making a decision. This is also the stage where I really want you to focus on the next 24 to 36 hours and not much beyond that. Focus on what's important to you and trust that you are going to be okay in the next 24 to 36 hours. Because for most of us, we're all going to be okay in the short term because we have resources that can help us. When we look too far ahead, the level of uncertainty is too great, and we can get caught up in some of those catastrophic thoughts that can really get us spinning. And finally, I want you to think about moving away from the what ifs to the what is now. So for those of you who check the depression stage, this is, again, like I said, one of the hardest stages to be at. And what I am going to say might feel really impossible, so bear with me. This stage is about creating a vision for what life could look like given the things you have lost. This is where you can move into the future, right, and begin to make some plans based on the things that you know are important to you and that can create peace and joy. For physicians, this is perhaps the stage where you would connect with colleagues and discuss different ways to practice medicine given the changes. This might be the time to talk to your spouse or partner about how to live life differently from the way you're living it now. Moving away from focusing on what is wrong and how terrible things are, but rather on what you can do to be creative given what's happened. And as hard as this may be, this is the stage to dream and visualize a different life. I encourage you to use this stage to daydream and to think about what you would do if you didn't have to worry about an income or providing for everyone that you provide for, and if you didn't have all the responsibilities that you have. Pick the things in your life that really have meaning for you. And this, for me, is a stage where hope can return. Acceptance is the stage about reflection. This is the time when we can reflect back on the things that we have gained as a result of the losses that we've experienced. It can be a time to reset expectations and the path forward. For some physicians, this may be the stage where there is some permission to do something different in your career. There may have always been some ambivalence about being in medicine, and perhaps these losses and changes can provide permission to seek a new path. Build on some of that dreaming that you did in the depression stage and see if there is a way to move in that direction. You can also use this stage to build your capacity and maybe try something different in your life. Perhaps try a new sport, go to a different restaurant, maybe break out of your routine a bit and branch out into something that you've always wanted to try, but have never had the time, the energy, or the money to try before. If you find yourself in the meaning stage, I want you to use the stage as an opportunity to regain purpose and motivation. In this stage, we move into action and concrete behaviors that help move us into the new ways of practicing medicine or living your life. This is where we allow ourselves to see our strength and resilience in overcoming something devastating and turning it into something that we can embrace and has energy behind it. If you find that you enjoyed a new activity, how do you make that part of your new routine? If you find something that you've always done no longer serves you or provides you with the energy, passion it once did, then feel okay about letting it go. This is where our lives begin to look different and we're no longer afraid that it does. This is all very difficult to do, and you may find that you're frustrated and can't find ways to take these actions within these stages, and that's completely okay. The goal, honestly, is just to be thinking about ways to be strong within the stage and to move away from that sense of hopelessness or powerlessness. The key is to identify the stage you are in and then engage in some of these helpful behaviors so that you can at least feel like you are doing something.
Hey. Well, thanks for sharing all that information, Fleur. You've given us a lot to think about. Before we wrap up tonight, could you just summarize some of your points for us?
Absolutely, Terry. I know that we've shared a lot of information and we've done it all very quickly, and we've had you doing some self-reflection, and all of that I know is hard to digest in such a short period of time. And so I'd like to share with you some key points that if you're able to take one or two of these things away with you tonight, then I think it'll be a great start. So the first thing I want to say is that you are not alone, even if it feels like no one else understands. Our Mentimeter actually demonstrates that lots of people probably out there do understand and are experiencing very similar things. And in fact, most people are experiencing grief at the loss of normalcy right now. And we are in this together, and it's okay to share our grief. In fact, I think it's really critical to be sharing our grief with one another. Emotions are neither dangerous nor toxic, good or bad, but rather a signal for us to pay attention to our needs. You need to acknowledge that the emotions that you're having are part of a grief process. You can name your emotions And when you do so, you'll have an easier time managing them. Be compassionate with yourself and others. Find ways to be empathetic and provide others with the benefit of the doubt, especially when you see them behaving in ways that are not familiar to you or you find frustrating. Be self-aware. Notice if you're falling into some of the extremes of omnipotence where you feel like you have to be everything, all knowing, all seeing, all powerful, or impotence, where you're feeling like you can't do anything and you have no agency. We are potent and we can have effect and influence, and we have limitations. Try to find the balance rather than living in the extremes and in these worst case scenarios that our very brilliant minds can take us to. Create curiosity versus judgment. This is a very powerful state to be in, and it'll really just help with some of that self-awareness and really move us away from thinking that there is anything wrong with us or what we're going through. You are doing the best you can, and sometimes getting up and going to work is enough. And finally, if you do feel that you're stuck or really struggling, this is a great time to reach out to a therapist, and we can certainly help you that through the PFSP line, which is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Next slide, please.
Well, thank you so much again, Fleur and Terry and everyone who's contributed tonight. So much helpful information. So now as we've come full circle, I think we've had a chance to think about that our distress is actually related to our losses. Someone said, never waste a good crisis, so hopefully we'll find ways to adapt, new ways to do things, to be creative and innovative, and be able to focus on those wins. On a personal note, I think some of you who know me know that I like to rock climb. And over the last week, I had a chance to get back to this after being off the wall for 3 months. And with my very first climb, I realized, wow, I had lost so much. I had lost so much in my climbing skills and my fitness. And my thought was, oh, I'm going to have to put in so much work to get back to my previous baseline, to get back to normal. But maybe I'm never going to get back to normal. Maybe I'm going to have a new normal and it might look different. And I've thought about this analogy all throughout this webinar, how with all our losses and grief that we do all have a lot of work to do, but it's really important work if we want to get better so that we can get to our new normal. And we probably will be different, but we'll all have grown, I think, from this incredibly challenging experience that we've been through. So to finish off, I'm going to ask you to do one more exercise. Could I have the next slide, please? So we'll invite you to write down some examples of ideas that you might have found meaning during these difficult times, how this experience may have altered our meaning and purpose, maybe in your personal life, maybe in your professional life, or some thoughts of gratitude. We won't have time to summarize these responses, but we'll scroll through the screens for a minute or two so that you can share them. So we'll give a minute or two so that we can start to see some of those results. And then we're going to wrap up where we have Fleur walk us through how you can reach the PFSP and what happens, and then a few final closing comments. So let's take a moment for self-reflection.
While we wait for some of the results to start appearing on the slide there in front of you, I am seeing them in the back end. We are getting some good responses here. A lot of comments around people kind of taking this as an opportunity to pause and reflect and think about ways that they can maybe slow down, reconnecting with their families. Those kinds of ideas are starting to come out. A few people talking about, using it as a time to focus on health goals as well, and actually trying to make the best of this time. So I see they're scrolling now, so I'll let you read some of those, but lots of really great comments coming in.
Oh, thank you everyone for sharing. I know I'm going to sleep better tonight after a whole bunch of this positive energy here.
Okay. Well, that was a really wonderful way to end things off. But just before we do finally end, I'd like to remind all of you that if you're feeling that you need some support or counseling, please give us a call at PFSP. Now, I know it can be difficult to make that call, especially if you don't know exactly what to expect. So since we have Fleur here, and she's one of the 3 people who answers that line 24/7, I'm going to ask her to briefly explain the process.
Okay, well, I'll start by saying it is actually 24/7. So we do answer your call, and we're not fussed at all, depending on your schedule. And so just feel free to call whenever it's convenient for you, when you have some time to chat. And so the line is answered by either myself, John, or Julia. So you'll be speaking to the 3 of us, and the 3 of us kind of work fairly intermixed with one another. So we're fairly aware of, if calls and continuity needs to happen with calls, then we can share that information between ourselves. So when we first receive your call, we will ask you to provide us with some demographic information, such as your name, your address, date of birth, and the reason you're calling into the program. And there are several reasons that people call the line. And the most common reason is to access counseling services. Another reason that physicians call the line is if you happen to be feeling distressed and just want to talk confidentially with another physician. The line is absolutely not limited to crisis calls, and being proactive about your mental health is important and actually super helpful. The next step would be for you to speak with our on-call physician for discussion regarding your concerns. And if during that discussion you decide that it would be helpful for you to talk with one of our therapists, then we will call you back and provide you with their contact information. And then you could go ahead and reach out to them directly to book your appointments with them. If for any reason the therapist we connect you with is not a fit, then absolutely do call us back and we'd be happy to connect you with someone else. This entire process is confidential and there's no identifying information that is shared with the AMA. Next slide, please.
Okay, thanks for that, Fleur. And we want to thank all of you for participating tonight, for sharing your thoughts, and for taking the time to reflect during this webinar. We also want to thank AMA and their team for this opportunity for PFSP and WellDoc Alberta to collaborate on this. And a special thanks to Fleur Umal for sharing her expertise with us today. Remember to give us a call at PFSP. Our number is 1-877-767-4637 or 1-877-SOS-4MDs. You can find out more about our program on the AMA website. Also, please watch for a new podcast on the topic of grief and loss in the AMA's One Nail at a Time series. And just a reminder that any questions submitted this evening will be answered on an FAQ document and sent to all participants.
We also want to let you know that we will have a small handout with Fleur's advice in terms of the different strategies you can use during the different stages of grief. And we want to point you towards some helpful resources for physicians at our WellDoc Alberta website that includes a 2-page summary bulletin, again, around the concept of grief and loss. And we'd like to acknowledge Dr. Elizabeth Wallace and Dr. Janet DeGroot, who contributed to that bulletin, and we've used some of their content here tonight. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for taking some time to take care of yourselves. Thank you for sharing your experiences. It's really been quite emotional to know that you were willing to do that with us tonight with this experiment. Watch out for each other. Reach out for help when you need it or even before you need it. And have a great night.